'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mamma in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave a luster of midday to objects below. When what to my wondering eyes did appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment he must be Saint Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen. To the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And then, in a twinkling, I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler, just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him, in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew, like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."
Although it may be hard to believe, the way we celebrate Christmas is a little less than 200 years old. In many people's minds, Christmas is as ancient as time itself, and the way we celebrate it is just as old. This is the furthest thing from the truth, and our holiday celebrations are really an invention of tradition. At the dawn of the first Industrial Revolution in the early part of the 19th century, the United States was undergoing a huge transformation. The Jeffersonian Revolution in 1800 changed the direction of democracy, its politics, and public policy. Northeastern cities were industrializing and urbanizing the rural areas just outside of previous city limits. And in 1822, the U.S. Constitution gave white non-property owning men the right to vote. The political and social changes that were taking place were bringing about a clash of traditions and a mixing of the classes that the upper classes were not happy about. In an attempt to change behavior and separate the American aristocracy, that 1% of the 19th century, from the rest of the plebeian public, three men, through 4 publications, created a new tradition designed to appear as an old one, which changed the way we have celebrated Christmas for the last 190 years. It's now 2020, and the United States, along with the rest of the world, is undergoing a gigantic transformation in our social interactions, our economy, and every part of our lives, including the way we celebrate holidays in general, but Christmas in particular. These changes are being done to us and intended to alter, if not kill, traditions of all kinds and social interactions everywhere. It is no longer acceptable to have parties with more than just a few people gathered together. Visits with Santa Claus require masks and reservations, and stores around the world are limiting what people can actually purchase by covering up the merchandise in the store, yet keeping it on display. And, like the 19th century, a very few people are creating the conditions that are changing the way we live and the way we celebrate. This is social engineering. This is the end of holiday celebrations as we know them. This is the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Before the introduction of Santa Claus, presents for children, or even the Christmas tree, the season of Christmas in America and Europe was a much different experience than it is today, but with some similarities. It's important to point out that by the time of the American Revolution, pious and devout Christians of all types, not just Catholics, celebrated Christmas, but only in church, and December 25th was still considered an ordinary working day. But for others, December was the end of the harvest, a time of leisure for farmers and farmhands before the deep freeze of winter and after the work was done. There was a time of bounty of harvest, of newly fermented beer or wine, and a time when fresh meat from freshly slaughtered animals was available and had to be consumed before it spoiled. The season of Christmas was not a one-day celebration, and it was a time of rebelliousness, public drunkenness, excessive eating, aggressive begging, the mocking of authority figures, and home invasions of wealthy households by the lower classes. This was a season of misrule and wassailing, of mumming and Christmas carols. Misrule meant behavior regarded by the genteel and religious as that of drunkenness, rioting, cross-dressing, fornication, and recklessness. But this was the end of the season and a time of blowing off steam, when the poor claimed the right to march into the houses of the wealthy landowners, enter their halls, and receive gifts of food, drink, and sometimes money. This season was a societal pressure release valve that kept class resentments in check. So, at this time of the year, the lords of the manors would open their homes to the peasants, servants, and apprentices, and feasted them. And in return, the lower classes offered their goodwill, or in modern terms, a verbal agreement that they would continue to work the fields obediently the rest of the year. The gifts given were in the form of food and drink, and were consumed in the presence of the giver. These were gifts given from the wealthy to the poor, or employer to employee. In later times, in a similar lord-to-servant gesture, money was put into a Christmas box for paper carriers or coffee house employees. But in this case, the transaction was consumer to service provider. We can see that tradition extended to contemporary times in the form of end-of-the-year tips to letter carriers and others we see all year long, as a form of thank you for service well done, and of course, goodwill. But by the early 19th century, the gentry, the aristocrats and upper classes, who in generations before tolerated misrule, were no longer willing to keep the lower classes in their place through this safety valve. The rituals that worked for centuries before in the agrarian societies of Europe, England, and America did not fit into urban cities, especially in northeastern American cities with Puritan and Protestant non-ritualistic roots. The old culture and customs of public misrule and role reversal at the end of the year were now at odds with the practicality of a new urban environment and genteel society. The social contract between lower and upper classes had come to an end. No longer was there an oath of goodwill in exchange for feasting at the end of the long agrarian season. Class, social and economic differences were forming at the dawn of the first industrial revolution. And it was this clash of classes and traditions in which the idea to create new holidays, practices, and traditions was formed. Traditions that conformed to this new urban industrial age.
The St. Nicholas who became Santa Claus is a complete fabrication, and he started life in New York City. In fact, the origin of the way we celebrate Christmas today is rooted in New York City by a group of wealthy civic leaders who all knew each other through the New York Historical Society. Nicknamed the Knickerbockers, these were men who all belonged to a distinct social set, the old aristocracy of the city, and they picked up their name from a satirical allegorical book, Dietrich Knickerbocker's History of New York, by Washington Irving. Irving, along with John Pintard and Clement Clark Moore and others within their circle, were Federalists, politically conservative and reactionary, and considered democracy to be nothing more than mob rule. However, real mob rule was beginning to take place in the form of roaming gangs of young street thugs and members of the emerging urban proletariat. These bands of revelers were no longer staying within the confines of working-class neighborhoods, and they began to venture out across the city during the holiday period and into the city's wealthy neighborhoods, especially on New Year's Eve, making as much noise as possible in the form of what were known as Calathumpian bands. These groups and bands used drums, tin kettles, rattles, horns, whistles, and a variety of other instruments to wake the slumbering upper-class neighborhoods, in some cases remaining outside specific houses to deliberately disturb the wealthy occupants within. In the light of all these annual disruptions and the general political and social change that was taking place, the Knickerbockers were attempting to find a way to end what they thought of as immoral behavior and create new ways of public expression. But it wasn't as self-conscious as all that. Well, it was, but like all social change, the attempts made came in fits and starts, starting with the Knickerbockers' History of New York, various attempts at public holiday celebrations, and eventually culminating with the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. Although Washington Irving supplied the background and character sketches for the modern Christmas, it was John Pintard who provided the structure to build around and give the holiday shape. His first endeavors, however, were not New Year's events, nor were they Christmas events. Instead, Pintard gave us an event that took place on the feast day of a saint that he would introduce through a broadsheet published in 1810, which proposed this saint to be the new patron saint of Old New York, and that was St. Nicholas. It's said that if John Pintard introduced St. Nicholas, it was Washington Irving who popularized him. Washington Irving is probably best known for his stories The Ghost of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. But before John Pintard introduced St. Nicholas to New York, and subsequently to the world, Washington Irving would provide a description, background, and mannerisms to the new St. Nick, later to become known as Santa Claus. In two different books, The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent and Bracebridge Hall, or The Humorous, a medley, in which he employed the narrator Geoffrey Crayon, Irving offered up several stories about Christmas traditions that never really existed, at least as they were described in the stories, but instead offered an invention of tradition. And it was those fabricated traditions that people latched onto and allowed Irving, Pintard, Moore, and others to create the Christmas in the original, new, old-fashioned way. If John Pintard introduced St. Nicholas and Washington Irving popularized him, it was Clement Moore who gave us the character we know today as Santa Claus. But he didn't create Santa from just Pintard's and Irving's work. There were also a number of earlier poems published between 1809 and 1823 by anonymous contributors, one of which gave St. Nick his sleigh and reindeer, which most likely gave Moore the material to create his poem that caught the public's attention and gave us the template for the big man himself, the embodiment of Christmas, Santa Claus.
The character who first appeared in Clement Moore's 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, you know the one, "'Twas the night before Christmas and all through the house," was the first embodiment of the character we now know as Santa Claus. This St. Nicholas is nothing like the historical St. Nicholas, who is the patron saint of Greece and Russia and is celebrated in the Netherlands. That St. Nicholas was a bishop who is thought of as the patron saint of children, brides, bootblacks, barrel makers, and a plethora of other tradespeople. But the Dutch St. Nicholas, who was celebrated on December 6th and now the 25th, is not the same character as the American Santa Claus. Although St. Nicholas may have been the inspiration for John Pintard and the Knickerbockers, who were looking to the old Dutch culture of New Amsterdam as a guide to influencing the contemporaneous culture of New York, there is no evidence that the Dutch St. Nicholas traveled with the Dutch settlers and traders of 17th century New Amsterdam only to reemerge later in the early 19th century New York. The Santa Claus, we know, was created self-consciously by a number of contributors, and it was that origin of this character that gives Santa Claus his ancient, folkloric authenticity. But it was Santa's activities, delivering presents to children around the world and wishing everyone a Merry Christmas, that gave him the sheen of newness and joy, which made him the perfect capitalist vessel and the perfect spokesman ever. One of the biggest changes that took place in society with the reinvention of Christmas was the reinvention of childhood. To be fair, society was naturally moving toward recognizing children as more than just small people or servants that were relatives. But those changes were coming slowly over time. And it took the reinvention of Christmas and its emphasis on family gatherings inside the home that kick-started the transformation. But it wasn't just children that were being transformed. It was the family unit as well. The domestication of Christmas was the cause and the effect of the domestication of childhood, which in turn recreated the family. Before the reinvention of Christmas, the family was merely a means of creating workers who would help keep the family operating and keep the family name going. But now the family was a unit that was about children and their happiness. Childhood was now a thing. It was now revered as a time for children to be children and a time to have fun, be happy, and learn how to be adults. And the instrument used to encourage these transformations of the family unit and childhood itself is as much a symbol of Christmas as Santa Claus himself. And that symbol is the Christmas tree.
More than Santa Claus or exchanging gifts or Christmas itself, the Christmas tree is thought to be the ancient symbol for the winter holiday celebration, but it's not. It, more than any other contemporary symbol of the season, has single-handedly and physically replaced other, truly ancient symbols of the past. The Yule log, wassailing, and caroling now only exist as concepts in people's minds, or they are watered-down customs that are not practiced in their original form. The Christmas tree is the reason we exchange gifts with one another. As we pointed out before, gifts were given in the past, but they were given from the Lord to the servant, from high to low. The Christmas tree was the medium for equal exchange from one to another, but also parent to child. And as we also pointed out before, not because the child is a servant, but because the child is a child. In reality, the Christmas tree is not ancient at all, and wasn't adopted into mainstream American culture until the 1830s. It came from Germany, but it didn't come from German immigrants, and wasn't adopted into mainstream German culture until around the same time. Like St. Nicholas, the Christmas tree was introduced as if it was an ancient and authentic folk tradition. It originated in the last third of the 18th century and was a local custom in Strasbourg, Germany. And the spread of the tradition throughout Germany can be attributed to the author Goethe. At that time, the tree had wax candles attached to it. They were lit for a short time and only revealed at a specific moment on Christmas Eve. Gifts were tied to the branches of the tree, and the whole spectacle was hidden from the children of the house until that special time when the children were brought into the room to take in that special, magical moment. An American visiting Germany wrote letters to his father, a Unitarian minister, about the Christmas tree ritual with its focus on children and the family. The tree, with its magical reveal, fit an agenda of promoting the new concept of family and was at the crux of differences in child-rearing at that time. Like the story with St. Nick and the Knickerbockers, the Christmas tree was related to an agenda and an effort to change society through the way children were raised and how they were taught. New methods of education were being developed by members of the Unitarian Church in Boston, and we can thank the Unitarians for the widespread adoption of the Christmas tree, which coincided with the new Christmas rituals that developed in New York. Even though we can attribute the adoption of the Christmas tree through efforts and agendas of cultural reformers in the Unitarian Church, we can also see that their concepts of family and children took place simultaneously with what was happening in New York and other cities in the U.S. at the time. The Christmas tree fit in with the cult of Santa Claus, the new commercial opportunities that arose through gift-giving, and the transformation of children, childhood, and the family.
Despite our belief that the way we celebrate Christmas is ancient and has been going on for centuries, Christmas before the 19th century was celebrated in ways that are much different than today. The change in how we celebrate was intentional in order to transform behavior from raucous roaming throughout the city, town, or countryside to a quiet family celebration by moving the celebration from out of doors to in. It's important to point out that the development of the Christmas holiday season that we celebrate today was not created overnight, but over a period of 10 to 20 years. John Pintard originally focused on December 6th, St. Nicholas Day, in order to promote the saint as a symbol and the patron saint of New York. But he changed his focus to January 1st, New Year's Day, and then ultimately to December 25th, Christmas Day. We also want to emphasize that throughout that time, the promoters of Christmas, St. Nicholas, and the Christmas tree were interested in changing social behavior by taking Christmas out of the street and putting it into the home, recreating childhood and redefining the family unit. Today, we are looking at a big push to change social behavior in our society. The kind of behavioral change that is larger than what resulted in the reinvention of Christmas. This change, however, is not coming from a few urban, paternal, antiquarian-minded rich men who want everyone to behave more like them. It's coming from the billionaire, technocratic, ruling class, and their reasons are far more sinister than what we are being told they are. The billionaires want to make more money, and the traditional, classical form of capitalism cannot provide more with just investing, manufacturing, selling, and buying. The cost of real estate and rent for spaces to sell products, the cost of labor, and the cost of infrastructure that people use to move around are eating into their profits. Malls, stores, offices, and places where people gather and socialize need to go away. People need to be pushed into smaller spaces and stay in their homes on their computer screens.
Every part of our lives, all the things that we did before, are being changed and labeled as the new normal. These changes are being done to us, to discourage us from going out into public by modifying our behavior and keeping us in line. It's more cost-effective and easier to use propaganda about a disease to sell fear and to sow doubt in order to keep people from effectively questioning their narrative while keeping track of us while we're learning, shopping, socializing, and working online. Our social lives with family and friends, especially around the holiday time, are being eroded away. Where we once had crowds of people at public holiday events, we now have virtual tree lighting ceremonies online. The throngs of people shopping at malls and stores have been modified and limited to minimize the amount of people at one time in one place, or forced online through making our experience as uncomfortable as possible. We are being trained not to gather in crowds so that we do not revolt against the changes that are happening and the changes that will come. Christmas parades are now reversed, where the sights and sounds are stationary while we drive by, and visits with Santa for the kids in the now empty malls involve making an appointment and wearing a mask.
This could be one of the last Christmases that we have, if not the last Christmas. It's now time to make positive changes for ourselves and our society. as a result of this intentional manipulation of our lives. Maybe it's time to leave behind the empty gift giving that has come about through the last 180 plus years of holiday-driven consumerism and go back to the more social interactions of the past. But in order to do this, we have to stop obeying the orders and mandates that the ruling class, the politicians, celebrities, and influencers are giving us. These are the same people who conned us into the overconsumption and deficit spending of Christmas time, and it's time to stop listening. If we're to regain our humanity, it's time to get outside with large groups of people and make some noise. We need to rethink and reinvent our traditions, rituals, and practices. To do that, we need to be social again, and possibly look back to the way we lived and celebrated before the Great Reset, before COVID, and before the reinvention of Christmas. And who knows, maybe we won't go back to the days of misrule or wassailing. But whatever we call it, we have to go back to demanding our share and claim our right to march into the houses of the ruling class, enter their halls, and receive the food, drink, and the gifts that we deserve. But most importantly, we need to demand our right to take back our lives. There is no greater gift.